Good afternoon. How are you today, this President's Day? And relying on Thomas Jefferson, once a president, who also thought of himself as a scientist. If you were to describe the weather today, it might be a little confounded, as I am, as you might be. It's 44 degrees, but it's more comfortable than it has been in days. And I guess the difference is the wind. I can't think of anything else. The things that are on our mind collectively today, there's basically two areas, if you squint, come up daily. And one of the reasons is not to repeat what was said, but to inform us of developments. And it's not like a soap opera, because this is damn serious stuff. And there are a whole bunch of contradictions. Most of my life, when I've thought of people in public life, I thought one of the things they were trying to prove was that by experience and intellect and resolve, that they could do the job. And that how they would do the job fit most people in a district or state or wherever, whatever the political entity was. And for those that disagreed, there would be found a compromise, which is why politics transcends a lawless world where the only way to resolve things is by power and threats, and defeating your opponent by coercing, caging, killing them. So what we have now is a situation in which we have a self-described genius Trump, but he plays the fool, and he dances about as much as he can lift his heavy feet to the tune of, see, look at me, look at how well I'm doing. But under closer examination, what we find out is he's really a fool prancing around, and not like the fool in tarot cards, a real fool, a genuine fool, a person who deceives himself and at least the base that he has as to how foolish he is. And in the end, his defense to claims of lying and fraudulently asserting value and loss of value, depending upon whether he wants to make a loan or a sale, that everybody sees through it. And so the genius is the kind of old fool, the fellow who's going to get away with the crime. But this guy, unlike some guys, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. He's that guy. He can't do the time. And so he fights to every last breath, in a metaphorical sense, to get by claiming he's a victim. He's a victim of everybody else calling him out for what he's been doing for years that is easily verifiable by the actual statements he filed that a court considered. And thus he has a huge nut to crack. 370 million plus judgment. Now, here's where the fool and those of us with popcorn and Coca-Cola are watching carefully. How do you do the next loop-de-loop, you fool? And here's the challenge that he faces. He has to come up with either the money itself. Okay, so 370 million plus, that's not going to happen. So what is going to happen? Well, he tries to get a bond in which he pays a percentage, say $18 million. But the person who grants the bond is not going to be on that bond unless Trump can post collateral. Meaning, if they have to present the funds that correspond to the bond, if he doesn't produce the money, he has to have secured this relationship with property. But that property has to be approved by the court, or actually there's probably a master. I think there is a master. So, can he do it? Well, in the suspense game, the time to do this is today. That's right, President's Day. I don't know if the federal courts are closed, so maybe he gets a day of grace, an undeserved day of grace, but it's coming at him. Now, the federal system is similar, and that is to say that E. Carroll, she has this big nut as well. And how does Trump come up with, $88 million? Same setting. Going to have to come up with a bond or the money. Going to have to come up with collateral for whomever would issue the bond. So a couple of things here sound in tragedy for Trump. Not that I care about that. I hope tragedy for Trump because it's a victory for us because of what he's done. May he be able to appeal. Not if he can't put up the sums of money. So he's in a kind of bond between the possible and the downright foolish. Some people have said, what if Saudi Arabia came up with the money or something like that? Well, perhaps they could. I'm not sure I know of an objection at law for it. But would they put up the entire amount? Would that give Trump power over them? Because the key to Trump's game, and he is an expert about moving debt around the room, so that a bank, for example, gives him so much credit, they have to work with him because the amount is so large, it would mean the end of the bank. And so there's some of that as a challenge here, but the challenge is to whomever would put the money on the table for Trump to be able to appeal. So, he's no genius. He's no economic genius, unless lying is some sort of genius. But in my experience, if you can see through somebody's lie, that's not any genius. I have thought in the past as a prosecutor, and I still think it's true, that the cases that are harder to prove involve documents. And that's true in the case here. Except how he did it was pretty arrogant and traceable. And I don't mean to minimize the experts who had to testify about what he did. But it's clear that, and that's especially true in the report made by the judge for the $350 million damages. So if you want to see chapter and verse how simple was his deception, once you unearth the key documents, you read that judgment by the judge. So that's where we are locally, that is to say, here at home. Now there's more. That is to say that how did he spend $50 million on lawyers? So that's gone. And you're going to have to buy, I don't know, 100 million of his not so snazzy sneakers to get him any amount of money that counts. And I don't know about you, but I don't see a Trump perfume or cologne in my future. And if I did, I think the same kind of math applies. It's a drop in the bucket for the sum he has to pay. And lest you think that's the end of it, there are members of Congress and police who have sued him for what happened on the Hill and the insurrection in Congress and what they all went through. And that suit is alive and well. It was upheld and not dismissed as his lawyers requested. So if there's a simple way to look at where we go from here, it appears to me that New York is beating his brains in. And New York has always been a place that knew him best. I say this as a guy who was brought up in New York and was there old enough to see him wandering around, making a fool of himself, but getting away with it, hanging out with mobsters, shortchanging people, a failed casino operator. It goes on and on. Everybody knew in New York who Trump was. And so he fled the city when perhaps he should have been attending to PR in anticipation of what would happen should he lose office as he did in 2020. His objections notwithstanding. So what we have is we have a guy who is going to continue to get beaten up in terms of having the resources to war. I have, in some moments in civil litigation that is complicated, said there are several things that one has to consider. Do you have a defense or a complaint? Yes or no? Do you have the evidence to prove the defense or complaint, even if it's not required that you do so? And then the third one, which is the hardest, is how much justice can you afford? Meaning, discovery, lawyers, experts, hotels, depositions, all of those things cost. And so you have to choose your battles carefully. I don't think he's done that. Now, what else is going on? The shorthand, we have Mike Turner basically was warning us that Russia is thinking of or has put satellites in the sky. They could rain down on the Earth or shoot at our satellites, and they may or may not be nuclear. And everybody is running down this disclosure. This is an important disclosure, especially at a time when we're at odds with Russia, like no time in recent history, principally starting with Ukraine, but now spreading to other matters. So bombs from the sky are not just a fear tactic. They're a real thing when we're talking about Russia. Now, Trump is not the only useful idiot. We also had Tucker Carlson over there kissing the knees of Putin and looking stupid for doing it and giving us assurances that are not supported factually or in a policy fashion, because there has been a rush to support Putin in his aggression against Ukraine, its own citizens, and NATO. This is not something that we can shrug off, you know. Navalny, who died, killed by Putin, is an example of the resistance at home. And in Ukraine, we have the situation of Avdiivka, I believe is how you say it, in which in recent days, Putin has dropped 1 million pounds of bombs on this area, turning it to dust. It had already been attacked, driving out most of the people who were there. And consider the fact that there were 900 people staying there after the war began, and now they're down to 30, I believe. Well, they went from 30,000 to 900,000, and now there are just too few there. And the question is, will any of them live and they can't get out? And whatever the real numbers are, the answer is we haven't done what we promised we'd do. We made possible this terrible, terrible destruction in eastern Ukraine. And where are the Republicans? Nowhere to be found. Our country appears to be influenced by our enemies, while at least one party, the Republicans, are running down our allies and our criticism of this human rights violator, Putin, this throwback to Stalin, this empire builder who wants to take Russia back to the days of the Soviets and march west through NATO. I'm not saying he's unrealistic, but if we're not putting ourselves in place and compromising that advance, we're missing the opportunity to save a people that we have said we support. Now, not all Republicans have forgotten their party's belief that Russia is never a friend, always one to be considered askance and carefully, and in times like these, to worry about his military intent and what, if any, role China might play in that advance by Putin. So that's what I got to say on this marvelous day, President's Day, from my cathedral of trees. And with any luck, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.